This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again one of Macon's most famous savants and all-around excellent person, Dr. Buck Melton. Buck, we normally start our little conversation about why you're not in a more senior political position in Washington. I mean, do you have any excuses to offer to the viewing audience tonight as to why you haven't ascended to a loftier position?
Well, if I did get promoted to a loftier position, my excuse would be that I didn't duck and run fast enough.
Well, okay, so there you go. All right, now after dismissing our introduction, we can now maybe talk about some different things. One thing that's been particularly alarming across the country is a recent outbreak of gun violence in Chicago, in Cook County. And it apparently was a war zone on the south and west side of Chicago this past weekend. That's very distressing. And it's a great dilemma in America as to what to do about that. And it brings up an argument for gun control. And apparently that's been attempted in Chicago. Is that correct? Can you opine on that?
It has more than once. As a matter of fact, probably one of the most famous occasions that Chicago attempted gun control is many years ago when it banned handguns outright, if I remember correctly. And that led to the McDonald decision, the Supreme Court decision of 2010, which is notable because it's the first time the Supreme Court incorporated a federal provision of the Bill of Rights against state governments for the first time since, I think, the 1960s, which said essentially not only does the Second Amendment prevent the federal government from taking our guns away, it also prevents state and local governments from doing the same thing. So it essentially struck down that very tight handgun regulation.
Now, just discussing that, I mean, does it actually say in the Constitution any government, or does it make reference to the federal government in the Constitution?
That goes back to the case of Barron versus Baltimore, 1836. And that was when the city of Baltimore did something, I forget exactly what, that would have violated one of the Bill of Rights guarantees. And the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall essentially extrapolated from the very first word of the Bill of Rights, which was Congress. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Yes.
And he said in that case, this meant that the Bill of Rights applies only to the federal government. It was never intended to apply to the state governments because the state governments have their own state bills of rights.
Yes.
It's the federal government that, based on our experience with Parliament, we feared. We don't fear our state governments. And then starting about 100 years after that, principally in the 1920s, 1930s, all the way through the 1950s, the Supreme Court began to say, for a variety of reasons, well, this provision of the Bill of Rights we are now going to extend against the state government as well. And that's what's called incorporating the Bill of Rights into the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. That was pretty much accomplished by the 1960s, and then out of left field, 50 years later, bam, the McDonald case. We're incorporating the Second Amendment as well.
Well, so is this judicial overreach? Is this what people are talking about judges doing as they being a strict constructionist in regards to the Constitution? I mean, presumably people imagine that if the Republican-oriented Supreme Court would basically swing things to the right, and a big part of that is the Second Amendment, having the right to bear arms. And so it would appear that in earlier generations, the Supreme Court did things in a liberal fashion. There was a sort of a democratic direction to do things that favored the Republicans. I mean, is that logic appropriate in this circumstance?
Probably not so much. The incorporation issue is a very complex one. Certainly the court has been highly activist at various stages in its history, and not necessarily always today we think when we hear the word activist, we think liberal. Not necessarily. You can be a conservative activist as well. The court was really probably taking its lead from Congress. There's an excellent argument that when Congress wrote the 14th Amendment, and if you will, rammed it down the throats of the states in 1868, that it did intend to extend the Bill of Rights to state governments. In 1873, the court said, no, we don't think so. And that may have been a wrong decision, and the court recognized that, because starting about 30 to 40 years after that, the court said, well, let's re-examine that, and then began to incorporate.
Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse, so to speak, or take this too far,
stuff,
but presumably the courts could say if the composition of the Supreme Court went the other way, they could, in fact, limit the Second Amendment by just saying, well, this just applies to to Congress. And so states or local municipalities can do as they please in regards to that. That seems to be possible with the reinterpretation. As it appears, just looking at the broad reach of history, the Supreme Court tends to sort of swing back and forth. I hate to say that. But it appears that it will often just sort of go with the wind a little bit and then make decisions that don't really comport with what the first reading of the Constitution would say should happen.
I believe it was Mr. Dooley, who was a very famous cartoon character. He was the Doonesbury of his day about 120 years ago. I believe it was Mr. Dooley who once said the Supreme Court follows the election returns. I'm not sure how much that is the case. Well, two things to remember. First of all, in the McDonald case, the Supreme Court was telling Chicago it couldn't ban guns.
Yes.
And secondly, if the court wanted to undo that, it probably would not, if you will, unincorporate the Second Amendment. I've never known the court to do that. It would find some other way to do that. But incorporation is pretty much a fait accompli at this point.
Well, okay, as far as a fait accompli or fait accomplis, they might change. I'll let it go and maybe move along, having, I guess, exhausted that conversation. Looking at actually what is provoking this gun violence. Firstly, guns are easily obtainable. Young people get guns, lots and lots and lots of guns, thousands and millions of guns floating around. And presumably, if guns were not available, knives or, I don't know, dynamite might be used. There are all kinds of weapons to injure people.
Baseball bats.
There are all kinds of ways. There are all kinds of ways to injure people.
Yes.
And what is seems something that's worth a comment is who are we going to blame for all this violence? So, the first thing to do is to blame the Constitution. Okay, after finishing that discussion. The next thing would be, I think people tend to think the police in some ways are not doing their job. And so it's the fault of the police. Now, a question to ask is, what do people want from their police? If the police are extremely diligent, it is certainly possible they could injure people, and I think that's happened in Chicago.
Oh, yes.
Because if you're a soldier in a war zone, it is possible that in protecting your own life, you might injure someone else. And I think the way things work with the police is that the idea is that the facts are kind of on their side. They have to enforce the law. They have to protect themselves. And so the courts give police substantial leeway, do they not, in fulfilling those responsibilities. If someone seems to threaten the police and they're enforcing law and order, then they certainly could use deadly force under some circumstances.
In many regards, yes.
All right.
So.
What about the idea that in Chicago, the police, it's said you should be more in evidence. On the other hand, you cannot easily use deadly force. You have to be very restrained about any I guess, encumbrances with the citizens there. And there's a limitation on the amount of money that's available to put the police in there, and how much the police are paid, and how stressful the job is, and the psychological injury that might take place with the police. And are the police at fault? I mean, what could the police do under these circumstances?
Well, that's one area we could look at, certainly. And the police cannot catch a break, because on the one hand they're blamed because they can't get the violence under control. And on the other, we have this huge spate, especially now that everyone's got a video camera, of alleged police brutality, police violence. And some of those, I want to say, certainly are justified. I think of the Charleston case of a few years ago when it was perfectly clear that the policeman exceeded his writ,
yes,
and was essentially a cold-blooded gunning
of course,
down.
yes.
There are bad cops, but for the good cops, you're trying to thread the needle. During the recent budget upsets here in Macon, I looked at some of the figures as to where our tax money goes, and the lion's share really does go in Macon to public safety.
Yes.
And so how much more money can we get to beef up the police department? It's just a no-win situation, I think, and I don't really know what to do.
Well, I think Chicago's economic situation is tenuous. Mm-hmm. So if you said, all right, we're going to prevent this by sending in huge numbers of police, and we're going to have to pay them more, and we're going to have all kinds of police round the clock in different places, I'm not sure that the community would necessarily like that. I mean, some certainly, and would the presence of in some ways, an alien police force just provoke more dissension and more tension, more deadly events?
Yes.
I mean, is that a cure for the situation?
It's possible, and there are a lot of initiatives to base the policemen in local neighborhoods and make them visible, and to make them an interactive part of the community, so the members of the community will inherently trust the policeman more and see him as someone who's there to protect and serve, as opposed to, well, consider the image of Barney Fife from a simpler,
yes,
easier generation, and just envision in your mind what he looks like, and compare that to the modern urban policeman wearing body armor, taser,
yes, right,
full automatic weapons,
yes,
helmets on occasion, and so yes, that sort of impression or persona is going to make people be standoffish. How do you get around that?
Well, now, just to continue, if we're trying to blame the Constitution, blame the police, is there a cure to declare martial law and put the National Guard into a troubled community, and is that legal? Can you use the National Guard to basically prevent such events? And has that ever happened? And I'll make a comment. In some places it has. I'm going to Brazil soon and going to Rio, and to give a paper. But basically, that state is just in a chaotic situation, mm-hmm, with terrible, terrible violence, and so the national government has just declared martial law and brought the army in. Now, is that legal? Under what circumstances could martial law be declared, and when is it legal to bring the National Guard in, and what are the constitutional, demarcations on doing something like that?
It's a fairly hazy area, except to say that it's not even really so much as declaring martial law. I mean, for instance, our governor here or our mayor could not just get up one morning and say, I think it's a good day for martial law. It has to be pretty clear that civilian administration of government has essentially completely broken down, either in the face of some sort of armed insurrection or natural disaster. It's got to be a pretty extreme circumstance for that to happen. The National Guard has a bit more leeway because the National Guard's mission has always been to be, if you will, an adjunct to law enforcement when the ordinary course of law enforcement is broken down. Sending in regular Army units or something would really be beyond the pale. I mean,
now that has happened.
General Sherman certainly did it in Atlanta.
I think this happened in civil rights days.
Yes.
I mean, I think in Mississippi, or maybe they
really Little Rock.
They used regular Army troops.
They did. They sent the 101st into Little Rock in '57 to help with the desegregation there. But that was a pretty extreme.
There's no regulation.
Situation,
I mean, obviously, no one would want to do this cavalierly. But is there any prevention from doing something like that? I mean, presumably the National Guard has been used often.
Yes.
In civil disturbances. Is it legal to use federal regular Army troops to do this? Other than the culture of the country is certainly against it, but is there any regulations against it?
The Posse Comitatus Act essentially says that the regular military cannot be used in a law enforcement function. So on the few occasions when that was done, it's been a pretty extreme situation to do that. So,
all right. Well, I pushed a little bit to.
Yes.
I mean, obviously that would have all kinds of extraordinary effects,
yes.
and certainly the citizens would not. I don't think. Maybe they would. I don't know if they really feel threatened, and just being safe on the streets. It could even be they might accept that. I don't know.
I would hope that they wouldn't. Well, I've always, as a civil libertarian that I am, and there seem to be fewer of us every year, I would rather be tyrannized by the lawless than be tyrannized by my own government. So I'm harking back to the good old days of 1776 there. But I genuinely mean that, especially when we talk about the Transportation Security
Yes.
Administration and such. But that's a big step. And the few times that it's been done, it's because usually the state, and we'll take Little Rock in 57 as the
Yes.
example. The reason why it was done then is because the state authorities were actually setting themselves up in opposition to federal authorities.
Yeah, so
and that's what
they might
allowed it
have
to
used
happen.
the National Guard there. May have not. It would have been shaky to have used.
Well, Orville Falbus actually said, I'm going to use the National Guard to keep the black children out of white schools.
Right.
And at that point, who was our commander-in-chief? Eisenhower. And,
Right, right.
and so he saw that as a sort of, incorrectly, but he viewed it as a sort of insubordination.
Yes.
And so he federalized the Guard. He told the Arkansas Guard, I own you now. You're in the service of the federal government.
Right.
And just to make sure you're not having any second thoughts, I'm going to drop the 101st in as well.
Wow.
So
that's pretty.
yeah.
You know, if you look at that, that's quite a. You know, you could really say, wow.
Yes, it was pretty extreme.
The president's really something, isn't he? Knew how to bounce the basketball, if one could say that.
Yes.
Well, all right. So I'm just continuing to probing this a little bit now. Many people would say this is a failure of the school system. It's a failure of social workers. It's a failure of what other failures are being cast upon the government?
I would say the failure of the economic system, since jobs are increasingly difficult to come by. So you have youth who've got a lot of energy, they've got a lot of strength, they could be used in a lot of technical jobs, and they can't find them, and so they're out on the street. That's another one.
So just to ask a question, I mean, presumably there are a lot of things going on here. Okay, so we say we're really looking at young minority youths, as best I can, male youths that are in a state of peril.
They're in inner city, underfunded
so,
public schools.
We can just go through a list, and these are what I'll name the society failures, and maybe we'll talk about personal failures. But the society failures would be, all right, the economic circumstances of the opportunities. So are there not a substantial methodology to do things? And center city youth, there are all kinds of scholarships, there are all kinds of special programs, and I think the school systems really make a huge effort to do something. And maybe I'm amiss in saying that, but they really try.
Yes.
And we can get into the circumstances, but the task is quite daunting. Another issue that say, well, it's society's fault because of the presence of drugs. So there's a huge, the economic underpinning of the gang culture is often their control over drugs. And there's this illicit drug arrangement that exists in the country. And could the federal government do something about the transmission of drugs in the south and west side of Chicago? I mean, what could they do? Presumably, one of the things happening are drugs are being legalized in some places, at least marijuana. So what about that? If we stopped the drug supply going into Chicago, would that cool things out?
Well, it certainly wouldn't hurt, but of course, we've had the DEA trying to do that for decades now, and to only limited success. I'm not sure that marijuana in itself is a problem. The harder drugs, of course, and the ones that are severely addictive, I think, are a major concern there. One of my law professors like to point out that if you want to encourage good behavior, the trick is to, and I quote, make it easy for people to do the right thing. And I'm not sure we're really doing that. Another factor to throw in here is, I think, the factor of religion. Now, of course, you've got to look at that somewhat guardedly. I mean, look at Northern Ireland, Protestants versus Catholics, or Shia versus Sunni. But the fact that that so many people are falling away from any organized religion at all in America, with their strictures of behavior, morality, do not kill, honor your parents. You know, even in a dysfunctional religion, you would hope that some sort of good behavior gets soaked in that way.
Yes.
And that's another problem.
Well, you have a lot of things going on, and I'll go a little bit longer on this line of conversation, and maybe we can talk to personal responsibility. But it could be that if the federal government really said, we're stopping the drug flow from Mexico or wherever into this country, so that if you're a baggage handler and you get caught doing something, it's life in prison. They're just onerous prison terms at any point, and really restrictive evidence. I mean, really big time changes. In other words, maybe cross-border incursions to basically violating the sovereignty of another country,
which we have done before.
But
yes.
Yes, we have, in order to protect the citizens of Chicago. If there's a drug war being levied against the citizens of Chicago with drugs coming in, does the federal government have the responsibility and a right to really, really ramp this up? I'm not sure how much a border wall, what that would do, or restricting immigration, how much that would do. But would that make a difference if the drug supply were cut off in a draconian fashion? It would require a tremendous challenge to personal liberty.
Yes.
So if you said you can't, we'll do anything to stop drug flow, including casting you in jail for 6 months as we find out what's going on, or doing this or doing that, or random drug searches, the death penalty. I mean, whatever things you could think of.
Summary execution.
You could do
whatever.
all kinds of. Yes, that's right. The way the Israelis do it. I mean,
yes.
So the Israelis, if they see a person that's threatening their country, they just execute them.
Yes.
I think that's a fair statement. And Mossad does that. So could the U.S. just arbitrarily execute people in other countries? I mean, I'm not suggesting any of this, but if it could be proved that the welfare of the country was substantially at risk, then that could be an option, could it not?
Are you asking legally, practically?
Both.
Legally, it would be a very, very big step.
If you declared war, I mean, could the Congress declare war against? Is the declaration of war have to be against a country, or could you declare war against a particular drug cartel?
I don't think, well, the idea of declaration of war is really almost an outmoded idea now. The last time we declared war was 1942, I think, against, it may have been Hungary or one of the Axis-controlled powers. And yet we've had a whole lot of wars since then.
Well, many of them, yes.
Yes. So yes, the United States certainly could use military force.
They get an act of Congress. They could say we give the president the power to take what steps are necessary.
Tonkin Gulf Resolution, 1964.
Well, we could have such a resolution in desperate circumstances.
Yes. So.
Okay. Well, I've probed that a bit. Okay. Now, getting a little bit into personal responsibility, it would appear to me that all these factors are going on, but that one of the biggest problems in the country, and that maybe in the south and west side of Chicago, is the absence of secure family units.
Exactly.
So if you look at the illegitimacy rate, it's just an extraordinarily high illegitimacy rate. And indeed, not just there, but all across the United States.
It's well north of 50%, 60, 70, 80%.
Right,
yes.
Particularly in those areas, but
yes.
even I think in the whole country, the illegitimacy rate is substantially above 25%. It's a huge thing, and it is an extraordinarily destabilizing, bad set of circumstances that doesn't give, there's not much discussion about it. So if you look at the south side and west side of Chicago, I've not heard anybody really say, what can we do to protect people here? How about a strong, secure family unit? And how about these young men that are growing up with no fathers there? And so the real question might be to ask is some kind of restriction on reproductive rights. If in fact you're having a lot of children, you can't look after the children. You don't have there's no male in the family. I mean, I don't know. There are things that possibly sanctions could be levied in these circumstances. Very delicate subject, but that would appear to be a root cause of what's going on in the area, among other factors. And I don't think there's any particular methodology to do anything about it. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think first, and I'll speak generally, I think you're getting to the heart of the idea now, to the problem now, that I don't think the imposition of external controls is ultimately the answer. Cutting off the drug supply or putting a tank on every street.
You don't want to like shoot people in Mexico City. Okay,
I don't think.
All right, I threw that out. Okay.
Well, it's not that I want to do it; it's that I don't think it works ultimately.
Well, maybe.
Especially in a libertarian Republican system, it has to come from the inside. It has to come from the culture.
Yes.
That's where the fundamental changes take place, and that's what you're talking about now with the family. You've got to have people commit to the idea of the nuclear family, to have the male role model there, to have a good educational system that will actually give a valuable education to the child. There's an incentive to stay in the school. He's got the backing of his parents to stay in the school. When he graduates, he can either get into college or find a good, decent paying job. Those
Yes.
will take care of it. The reproductive issue, now you can certainly do some policy things that we can make sure that we are not incentivizing the procreation of illegitimate children without any basis for support. But in terms of actually telling people that they must use birth control or that they can't have children or that they've got a quota, if you go in that direction, I must say you're attacking what is probably the greatest sacred cow in all of constitutional law at this point.
Which is?
The right of reproductive privacy.
Is that in the Constitution?
The Supreme Court says it is. They have secret.
That's another one, right?
No, they have secret Supreme Court decoder glasses, and they assure us that is a right. And
reproductive privacy.
The right of privacy, which the court essentially invented in 1965.
Yes.
And almost invariably, the court never really told us what that right was. It never really has told us, but it seems like every single time the court has brought it up, that right almost invariably deals with sexuality and reproductive rights. And it's absolutely, totally hands-off there.
Of course, I'm not sure how to go after what I would consider a social evil. I would say that. Mm-hmm. I mean, love child. I mean, everybody wants the next generation or everybody to be happy and kind and well cared for. You just want that, and how do you accomplish that? In many ways, it's a very vexing problem. I think religion could play a big role in this. Encouraging moral behavior. I mean, that's kind of a Pollyannish kind of thing to say. We're getting near the end of our conversation here, but rescuing Chicago really, I think, is going to come down to the people that live there. And all these external suggestions I came up with, I don't think they're going to work too well, but the community has got to do something about it. And maybe if there's some really bad people there in the community, they've got to say, these are bad people, we just don't want them here. We're going to and call them out. And so finally, my last comment is, one reason the police are having trouble is that no one will turn any of the desperados in. They're either intimidated or they consider the police an alien force. And it's a real detriment to the community, and the whole story is quite poisonous for the welfare of the country.
It is, and as you say, the community has got to make the decision to take ownership of the problem and to accept different values and then do what's necessary to turn things around. And that's a very big order in this day and age.
Well, Bucky, I think we had an interesting conversation
tonight
on this subject, and we'll have some more.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.